Sergeant Rachel Johnson stepped into the bustling airport terminal, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and exhaustion. After a grueling 6-month deployment, the familiar sights and sounds of home enveloped her, a bittersweet reminder of what she had endured. Clad in her military uniform, the fabric still carrying the scent of jet fuel and sweat, she navigated through the crowd with a sense of purpose. Each step echoed her resilience, a silent testament to her service. As she approached the check-in counter, Rachel glanced at her watch. Time seemed to stretch and compress, each moment laden with anticipation. The airline attendant greeted her with a warm smile, scanning her ticket before typing something into the system. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," the attendant said, her eyes sparkling with admiration. Rachel nodded, appreciating the gesture, but feeling the weight of her fatigue. Once through security, Rachel found herself at the gate, where passengers gathered like leaves caught in a gentle breeze. The announcement for her flight echoed through the terminal, and she felt a rush of excitement. Boarding the plane was a routine she knew well, yet today, it felt different. She was finally heading home. Settling into her assigned seat, Rachel took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of gratitude. The cramped economy section had become a second home during her deployment, but today she was grateful for the luxury of first class. The flight attendant approached with a bright smile, offering her a complimentary drink. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant. Can I get you anything else before we take off?" "Just some water, please," Rachel replied, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. As she watched the flight attendants prepare the cabin, she felt a sense of comfort wash over her. She had earned this moment, a brief respite from the chaos of her recent past. Just as Rachel began to relax, her thoughts drifting to family and friends waiting for her, the cabin door opened, and a well-dressed woman entered. The woman's designer handbag swung at her side, and her perfectly styled hair gleamed under the overhead lights. Rachel caught a glimpse of her expression, and a wave of unease washed over her. The woman's gaze landed on Rachel, and a flicker of disdain crossed her features, as if the very presence of Rachel in first class was an affront. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone dripping with condescension as she approached Rachel's seat. "I believe you're in the wrong section. This area is reserved for passengers who have, well, a different standing." Rachel's brow furrowed, the warmth of her earlier thoughts evaporating. She sensed the tension in the air, a thickening mist of discomfort that enveloped them both. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I have an upgraded ticket," Rachel replied, her voice calm, though her heart raced. The woman crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I don't think it's appropriate for someone like you to be sitting here. People like us," she gestured towards the other first-class passengers, who were now observing the unfolding scene with varying degrees of interest. "We expect a certain level of civility and decorum." Rachel took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of scrutiny pressing down on her. She had encountered prejudice before, but it still stung, especially now when she had hoped for a peaceful return home. "I understand your concerns," Rachel said gently, choosing her words with care. "But I assure you, I am where I'm meant to be." The woman's eyes narrowed, and the atmosphere crackled with tension. Rachel could feel the gazes of the other passengers boring into them, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. As the flight crew prepared for takeoff, the woman stood her ground, unwilling to back down. Rachel's heart sank, but she remained composed, her mind racing with the choice of how to respond. In this moment, Rachel understood that her reply could either fuel the fire of hostility or extinguish it with grace. She chose the latter, knowing that her service and dignity were worth defending. "We all deserve respect, regardless of our backgrounds," she said softly, her voice steady. "I hope we can both find a way to share this space with kindness." As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Rachel let out a slow breath, steeling herself for whatever would come next. The journey ahead held the promise of home, but it also carried the weight of unspoken words and unresolved tensions, leaving her uncertain of what lay in store. As the tension in the first-class cabin thickened, Sergeant Rachel Johnson sat frozen, her heart racing from the unexpected confrontation. She had just returned from 6 months of deployment, sacrificing everything for her country, and now she felt as if she were under siege by Susan, the well-dressed woman whose contempt was palpable. Rachel's brow furrowed slightly, not out of anger, but rather a deep-seated disappointment. "Excuse me, but I don't think it's appropriate for someone like you to be sitting in first class," Susan declared, her voice laced with disdain. Her arms were crossed tightly over her designer handbag, her posture rigid. "This seat should be occupied by someone more deserving, someone who truly belongs here." Rachel blinked slowly, taking a moment to process the words. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers shifting between her and Susan, an audience to this unsettling drama unfolding in the confined space of the airplane. She inhaled deeply, allowing the air to fill her lungs as she steadied herself. "Ma'am," Rachel began, her voice calm and even, "I'm on this flight because I was upgraded. I serve my country, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to travel comfortably for once." There was no bitterness in her tone, only an earnest plea for understanding. Susan scoffed, her lips curling in a sneer. "You think that just because you wore a uniform, that gives you the right to sit up here? This is for people who have earned their place, not just anyone who thinks they can take advantage of the system." The words stung, but Rachel felt a wave of empathy wash over her. She saw not just a woman blinded by prejudice, but a person trapped within the confines of her own ignorance. The whispers escalated around them, some passengers nodding in agreement with Susan, while others shot disapproving glances her way. A voice from a nearby seat broke the tension. "Just because she's black doesn't mean she doesn't belong here. She's a soldier." A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair leaned forward. "You should be ashamed of yourself for judging her based on her skin color." Rachel remained silent, choosing to absorb the moment rather than react hastily. She felt the weight of her fellow passengers' scrutiny and their divided support. The heat of the confrontation simmered in the air, but she took another deep breath, focusing on the rhythm of her heartbeat, reminding herself to remain composed. Just then, a flight attendant approached, her presence commanding attention. "Excuse me, ladies. Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone professional yet warm. "Ma'am, this woman is in the wrong seat. She doesn't belong here," Susan insisted, her voice rising. The flight attendant glanced at Rachel, then at the boarding pass in her hand. "Actually, this seat is assigned to Sergeant Johnson. She has every right to be here. If you'd like, I can escort you back to your seat." Susan faltered, her face flushing as the reality of her actions began to sink in. The murmurs in the cabin quieted, and for a moment, the space felt suspended in time. Rachel caught the eyes of some passengers, who looked at her with a mix of sympathy and admiration. "Thank you," Rachel said softly, turning her gaze to the flight attendant, who nodded in solidarity before walking away. Susan's expression soured, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. The flight attendant's words had shifted the atmosphere, but the discomfort lingered. Glares were exchanged, whispers continued, and Rachel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Just remember," Rachel added, her voice steady though her heart raced, "we all deserve respect, regardless of our backgrounds. I would hope that you might reflect on that." Susan opened her mouth to retort, but then closed it, unable to find the right words. Instead, she simply glared at Rachel, her fingers twitching nervously against the fabric of her handbag. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken thoughts. As Rachel settled back into her seat, her mind racing but her heart resolute. In that moment, she felt a surge of strength, embodying the very ideals she had fought for. She had not just defended her presence in first class. She had stood firm against the tide of prejudice, a silent warrior in a battle that extended far beyond the confines of the airplane. Sergeant Rachel Johnson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, yet determined to rise above it. As she pulled out her notepad, the smooth surface felt familiar under her fingers. She flipped to a blank page and began to write, her pen gliding over the paper as she poured her thoughts into words. Each stroke was not just a release, but a message of hope and understanding that she felt compelled to share. "Empathy is the bridge that connects us," she wrote, feeling the calmness wash over her. "No matter our backgrounds, we all share the same sky, the same humanity. Rachel paused, glancing up briefly to see Susan still glaring at her. Her elegantly manicured hands clenched tightly around her designer handbag. The woman's face was a mixture of confusion and irritation, as if Rachel's simple act of writing was a personal affront. But Rachel was undeterred. She continued to write, each word a silent protest against the prejudice that had been thrust upon her. As Rachel scribbled her thoughts, the tension in the cabin began to shift. Curiosity sparked among the other passengers. A few leaned slightly forward, their eyes darting between Rachel and Susan. "What's she writing?" One passenger whispered to another, who shrugged in response, equally intrigued. It was as though Rachel's calm demeanor was an antidote to the poisonous atmosphere that had enveloped the first-class cabin. "Why don't you just let it go?" Susan finally snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone here." Rachel looked up, meeting Susan's gaze with a steady, unyielding calm. "This isn't about proving anything," she replied softly, her voice clear and unwavering. "It's about understanding that we're all human, and that our experiences, no matter how different, shape who we are." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the cabin was silent. Rachel sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the collective breath of passengers who were beginning to reflect on her message. Encouraged by their growing interest, she carefully folded the note and, without hesitation, reached over to Susan. "I'd like you to read this," she said, her tone inviting yet firm. Susan hesitated, her brow furrowed in skepticism. "Why would I want to read anything from you?" she retorted, her voice still laced with irritation. "Because it's not just for me," Rachel replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's for all of us. Maybe it will help you see a different perspective." With a resigned sigh, Susan finally accepted the folded note, her fingers brushing against Rachel's hand for the briefest of moments. As Susan unfolded the paper, the words seemed to resonate beyond the written page. "We all face battles," Rachel had written. "Some are visible, some hidden, but every person deserves respect and dignity, regardless of their background. I hope you can see that." Rachel watched as Susan read, the irritation slowly melting away from her expression. The surrounding passengers leaned in closer, captivated by the unfolding drama. A man in a tailored suit whispered, "Wow, she's really handling this with grace." Another woman, visibly moved, nodded in agreement. For a moment, the cabin was filled with a tense silence, the kind that comes just before a storm. But instead of anger, a different kind of energy began to circulate among the passengers. They were no longer mere bystanders. They were witnesses to an unexpected moment of vulnerability and truth. Susan looked up from the note, her expression shifting from contempt to something softer, more reflective. I didn't realize," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The shift in her tone did not go unnoticed. The passengers exchanged glances, their eyes wide with curiosity. They sensed that something profound was about to unfold. Rachel felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, she knew that she had planted a seed of understanding. Perhaps, just perhaps, this moment could bridge the chasm that had divided them. As Rachel sat quietly, her notepad resting on her lap, she sensed a shift in the air around her. The tension that had once been thick enough to slice through with a knife began to wane. Susan, still seated across the aisle, appeared lost in thought, her gaze flickering between Rachel and the window, as if searching for answers in the clouds outside. "Do you really think writing that will change anything?" A voice piped up from the back of the cabin. It was a middle-aged man, his tone skeptical but not unkind. He wore a baseball cap and a worn-out t-shirt, a stark contrast to Susan's designer outfit. "People don't just change because you write them a note." Rachel looked up, meeting the man's gaze. "Maybe not everyone," she replied, her voice steady. "But sometimes, a small gesture can plant a seed of understanding. You never know what might grow from it." The man shrugged but leaned back in his seat, visibly intrigued. Rachel turned her attention back to Susan, who was still staring vacantly outside. After a moment, she decided to speak again, her words gentle yet firm. "You know, we all carry our own stories. our own struggles. I'm just trying to share mine, she said, her eyes softening. The cabin, once filled with whispers of discontent and judgment, began to hum with a different energy. A woman seated in front joined the conversation, her voice warm and inviting. I think what you're doing is important. We need more empathy in this world. I'm a teacher, and I've seen how prejudice can affect our youth. It's heartbreaking. Rachel nodded, grateful for the support. Exactly. It's not just about me or Susan. It's about all of us. We have to learn from each other. With the atmosphere shifting, more passengers chimed in with their own experiences. A young man with glasses spoke of his struggles with mental health and how societal stigma had once kept him silent. Another passenger recounted his experiences growing up in a racially diverse neighborhood, where he had learned to embrace differences rather than fear them. As the conversation flowed, Rachel could feel the weight of the moment lifting. Susan, however, remained quiet, her expression unreadable. Rachel could see the conflict playing out behind her eyes. Was she listening? Was she reflecting? Or was she still caught in the web of her own preconceived notions? Eventually, Susan shifted in her seat, her posture less rigid. I've never really thought about it that way, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I guess I've always, assumed things based on appearances. Rachel's heart raced. This was the opening she had been hoping for. It's easy to do that, Rachel replied gently. We all have biases. It's part of being human. What matters is what we choose to do with that awareness. The flight attendant, who had been quietly observing the discussion from the back of the cabin, stepped forward with a smile. I think it's wonderful to see everyone sharing their stories. It reminds us that we're all on this journey together. Her words resonated, encouraging more passengers to engage. As the plane cruised through the skies, the cabin transformed into a haven of shared experiences. Laughter, empathy, and understanding mingled in the air, weaving an invisible tapestry that connected everyone on board. Rachel felt her earlier weariness dissipate, replaced by a sense of purpose and solidarity. After a few moments, Susan stood up, her face now a canvas of vulnerability. Rachel, she called out, her voice steady yet soft. Can I talk to you for a moment? Rachel met her gaze, surprised but ready. Of course. As Susan walked toward her, the chatter around them faded into a hushed silence. The other passengers leaned in, curiosity etched on their faces. Susan stopped in front of Rachel, her expression transformed. I owe you an apology, she said earnestly. I was wrong to judge you based on your appearance and background. I see that now. I really do want to understand. Rachel didn't immediately respond. She searched Susan's eyes for sincerity. Thank you for saying that, she finally replied, her voice warm. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. I appreciate it. The moment hung in the air, charged with the possibility of understanding. Rachel sensed that this was more than just an apology. It was the beginning of a dialogue that could reshape not only their lives, but the lives of those around them. Susan leaned closer, her voice low. Can you tell me about your experience? I want to learn. I think it's important. And just like that, amidst the clouds and the hum of the airplane, a bridge was being built over the chasm of prejudice, one story at a time. Rachel smiled, ready to share her journey, knowing that every word exchanged had the potential to resonate far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Rachel leaned back in her seat, the hum of the airplane engines a comforting backdrop to the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. The flight had been unexpectedly tense, but now, as she faced Susan, she felt a sense of purpose emerging from the chaos. Their conversation had taken a turn, and Rachel was determined to share her story. Look, Rachel began, her voice steady. I understand where you're coming from, but I want you to know that my journey hasn't been easy. Serving in the military as a black woman has its challenges. She met Susan's gaze, which softened slightly. I've faced prejudice, doubt, and sometimes fear, just for being who I am. But I chose to fight against those challenges, not just for myself, but for everyone who feels marginalized. Susan shifted in her seat, her posture relaxing as she listened intently. I've never really thought of it that way, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I suppose I've been so wrapped up in my own world that I didn't consider others' experiences. Rachel nodded, encouraged by Susan's openness. It's easy to do. We all have our battles, but sometimes we forget that everyone is fighting their own fight. My service wasn't just about defending my country. It was about standing up for justice, equality, and the right of every individual to be treated with dignity. The other passengers, who had been silent observers, now leaned in closer, captivated by Rachel's words. A man in the back row, who had earlier supported Rachel, chimed in, "That's powerful. I can't imagine facing the kind of discrimination you've experienced while serving." Rachel smiled at him, grateful for the support. "Thank you. It's been a journey of resilience. Each time I faced a barrier, I found strength not just in myself, but in the community around me. We can lift each other up if we choose to see beyond our differences." Susan's expression shifted, a hint of remorse flickering across her features. "I realize now that I've let my own biases cloud my judgment. It's no excuse, but I grew up in an environment where these kinds of beliefs were normalized," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I never took the time to question them, to really see people for who they are." Rachel's heart swelled with empathy. It's never too late to learn and grow. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we respond to those mistakes. You're here, you're listening, and that's a step in the right direction. As the plane began its descent, the mood shifted palpably. The passengers who had been merely witnesses to the unfolding drama were now engaging in deep discussions. Stories of personal experiences, of prejudice and triumph, began to flow like a river breaking free from a dam. "Rachel," Susan said, her voice now steady, "I want to understand more. Can we talk once we land? I'd like to learn about your experiences firsthand, to really grasp what you've been through." Rachel smiled, seeing a genuine desire for change in Susan's eyes. "I'd be open to that. If we can create dialogue, perhaps we can inspire others to do the same." As the aircraft touched down, Rachel felt a mix of relief and exhilaration. The flight had been a microcosm of society, filled with conflict, misunderstanding, and finally, the seeds of understanding and growth. She glanced at Susan, who was now looking out the window, her expression contemplative. "Whatever happens next," Rachel said softly, "I believe that every conversation can lead to change. It starts with us being brave enough to speak and listen." The plane taxied to the gate, and as the seatbelt sign flickered off, passengers began to gather their belongings. Rachel felt an unexpected sense of victory, not just for herself, but for the collective growth she sensed among those who had witnessed the encounter. Once the plane doors opened, a journalist standing just outside caught Rachel's eye. He had been listening closely, his notepad at the ready. "Excuse me," he called out, approaching her with a respectful demeanor. "I overheard your conversation. May I speak with you? Your story has the potential to inspire many." Rachel exchanged a glance with Susan, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course," Rachel replied, her heart racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. She was ready to share her journey, to educate, and to promote understanding. In that moment, she knew that even the most difficult moments could lead to profound change when approached with compassion and courage. Days after the flight, Rachel Johnson found herself at the center of a whirlwind. The story of her encounter with Susan had gone viral, sparking a nationwide conversation about racism, empathy, and the human experience. News outlets clamored for interviews, and social media buzzed with reactions. Some supportive, some critical, but all deeply engaged with the dialogue Rachel's experience had ignited. Rachel sat in her living room, scrolling through her phone as she prepared for yet another interview. Her heart raced, not from anxiety, but from a profound sense of purpose. She had received invitations to speak at various events, sharing her story and advocating for understanding and compassion across divides. Each message she read reminded her of the weight of her journey and the importance of continuing to push for change. As she practiced her speech, the doorbell rang. It was her friend and fellow soldier, Marcus, who had been following the developments closely. He entered with a bright smile, holding a bouquet of flowers. "Hey, superstar, I figured you could use some cheering up," he said, handing the flowers to Rachel. "Thanks, Marcus," It's overwhelming, but in a good way, Rachel replied, placing the flowers on the table and taking a deep breath. I never imagined my experience would resonate so much with people. Your grace under pressure is what got everyone talking, he said, leaning against the wall. You turned a moment of hostility into a lesson on empathy. Rachel chuckled softly, shaking her head. I just responded the way I thought was right. I didn't expect to be a symbol for anything. Sometimes doing the right thing has a ripple effect. Look at Susan. She's been facing a lot of backlash since the story broke. Rachel frowned slightly, remembering Susan's initial hostility. I hope she learns from this. I really do. Everyone deserves a chance to grow, even when they stumble. Meanwhile, in her upscale neighborhood, Susan found herself grappling with the consequences of that fateful flight. The backlash was intense. Her friends and social circles had distanced themselves from her, unwilling to associate with the woman who had publicly confronted a soldier. As she sat in her elegantly furnished living room, the weight of her actions pressed heavily on her chest. She picked up her phone and stared at the notifications, most of them critical. A message from her old college roommate caught her eye. I can't believe you would act that way. You should be ashamed. The words stung, but they also sparked something within her. Fighting back tears, Susan realized she needed to confront her own biases and seek redemption. Determined to make amends, she began researching local organizations that fought against discrimination. Hours turned into days as she immersed herself in literature about social justice, diversity, and the importance of empathy. Each article she read peeled back layers of her ignorance, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truths of her own privilege. As Rachel prepared for her first speaking engagement, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She was set to address a community gathering focused on promoting understanding among different racial and cultural backgrounds. As she stood backstage, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she found Susan standing there, a nervous expression on her face. Rachel, I know this is unexpected, Susan began, her voice shaky. I just wanted to apologize for my behavior on the flight. I've been reflecting a lot on what happened, and I realize how wrong I was. I want to do better. Rachel was taken aback, her heart racing. This was not the confrontation she had anticipated. Thank you for saying that, Susan. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. I've been trying to educate myself, Susan continued, her voice steadier now. I want to advocate against prejudice and help others understand the importance of empathy. I hope you can forgive me. Rachel nodded slowly, processing the sincerity in Susan's eyes. I believe in second chances, and I appreciate you reaching out. It's a journey for all of us. The two women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their previous encounter lingering, but transforming into something hopeful. Both understood that their paths could intertwine for the greater good. As Rachel took the stage, she spotted Susan in the audience, a small smile on her face. With a newfound strength, Rachel began to share her story, not just as a soldier, but as a woman who understood the complexities of humanity. She spoke of the power of empathy, the importance of listening, and the necessity of bridging divides. The applause at the end of her speech was thunderous, but the real victory lay in the connections being formed, not just between Rachel and Susan, but among everyone present. In that moment, Rachel realized that her journey was just beginning, and the ripple effect of understanding could indeed change lives.